They were the most famous faces in the world. Their names lit up marquees, their voices filled stadiums, and their faces sold millions of movie tickets. Hollywood paid them fortunes that most people couldn't even dream of, and yet, behind the velvet curtains and the flashing cameras, many of them couldn't afford to keep the lights on. We're talking about stars who earned millions, sometimes tens of millions, and died with nothing. Stars who borrowed from friends just to eat. Stars who had the IRS knocking on one door while creditors banged on the other. Stars who took roles they hated, performed shows they could barely stand through, and signed deals that robbed them blind, all because the money was already gone before it ever hit their hands. From Judy Garland, who couldn't pay her hotel bill, to Sammy Davis Jr., who died $15 million in the red. From Bela Lugosi, who worked for Ed Wood because no one else would hire him, to Marvin Gaye, who recorded an entire album just to pay off his divorce. These are the golden age stars who lived all their lives on loans. Judy Garland. When Judy Garland sang "Over the Rainbow," she was dreaming of a place where troubles melted like lemon drops, and no one needed that dream more than Judy herself. Born Frances Ethel Gumm in 1922, she was thrust onto the stage before she could understand what a contract meant. By 13, MGM had her locked into a deal that would define, and ultimately destroy, her financial life. At her peak, Judy was one of the most bankable stars in the world. The Wizard of Oz, Meet Me in St. Louis, A Star is Born. She generated tens of millions for the studios. But Judy saw only a fraction. As a minor, her earnings were controlled by her mother, and MGM funneled back into the studio system through so-called expenses. The studio kept her on a grueling schedule, pumping her full of amphetamines to stay awake and barbiturates to sleep. By adulthood, she had never learned to manage money because she'd never been allowed to have any. Her spending was erratic: lavish hotels, an entourage, expensive gifts. 5 marriages, each divorce chipping away at whatever she'd saved, and the IRS became her most relentless co-star. Throughout the 50s and 60s, she owed hundreds of thousands in back taxes that ballooned until they were insurmountable. By the mid-1960s, Judy was borrowing just to survive. She bounced between hotel rooms in New York and London, often locked out because she couldn't cover her tab. She married her 5th husband, Mickey Deans, in March 1969, and 3 months later was found dead in their rented London bathroom from an accidental barbiturate overdose. She was 47. Her estate was hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. The rainbow never had a pot of gold. Not for her. Mickey Rooney. In 1939, Mickey Rooney was the #1 box office star in the world. Not Clark Gable, not Cary Grant. Mickey Rooney. He was 19, earning more than almost anyone in the business. Over his career, he earned more than $12 million, an astronomical fortune in mid-century money. So how did he end up broke? Mickey married 8 times. Each marriage brought wedding costs, households to maintain, divorce settlements, and alimony that stacked up relentlessly. He loved horse racing, gambling, lavish parties, and expensive gifts. He was generous to a fault, investing in ventures he didn't understand and lending money he didn't have. By the 1960s, he'd filed for bankruptcy. Hollywood's former biggest star was scrambling for dinner theater and television guest spots, not because he wanted to, but because he had to. His later years grew even more disturbing. In 2011, at 90 years old, Rooney testified before a U.S. Senate committee about elder abuse, revealing that his stepson had been financially exploiting him, controlling his money, isolating him from family, keeping him in financial captivity. It was devastating. This legendary entertainer, tears in his eyes, telling senators he'd been stripped of the ability to make even the most basic decisions about his finances. When Mickey Rooney died in 2014 at 93, his estate was valued at $18,000. His burial required the intervention of friends, and even in death, his family fought bitterly over what little remained. Sammy Davis Jr. Sammy Davis Jr. could do everything: sing, dance, act, do impressions, play multiple instruments. He was arguably the most versatile entertainer of the 20th century. He was also one of the most financially reckless. Growing up in vaudeville from age 3, he never had formal education or financial training. What he developed was a taste for the absolute finest things and an inability to say no to anyone, including himself. At his peak, he earned millions per year from Vegas residencies, films, and records. He was Rat Pack royalty, and he lived like it. Custom suits, a Beverly Hills mansion, luxury cars, gold jewelry, legendary parties where he always picked up the check. The problem was his spending consistently outpaced his enormous earning. He maintained a full-time entourage on his payroll, supported family members and hangers-on, and notoriously neglected his taxes for years, letting IRS debt compound into the millions. He took gigs he might not have accepted, simply because the money was already spent before he earned it. When Sammy died of throat cancer in May 1990 at 64, he left behind an estimated $15 million in debt. His widow, Altavize, was left with virtually nothing and struggled with the IRS for decades afterward. The man who lit up every stage he ever stood on left, this world owing more than most people will earn in a lifetime. Burt Reynolds. For 5 consecutive years, 1978 through 1982, Burt Reynolds was the #1 box office draw in America. At his peak, he earned roughly $10 million per film and owned a sprawling Florida estate, a ranch, a dinner theater, and more properties than most people could track. So when he filed for bankruptcy in 1996, the entertainment world was stunned. The unraveling began with investments. He poured millions into his dinner theater, a passion project that hemorrhaged money. He backed a failed restaurant chain and business ventures recommended by friends without due diligence. One by one, they cratered. Then came the divorce from Lonnie Anderson in 1993, spectacularly ugly and expensive. The settlement, legal fees, child support, and alimony drained whatever reserves remained. Meanwhile, his career had cooled. Smaller paychecks couldn't service the mountain of debt. He sold his estate, his memorabilia, his cars, anything to keep creditors at bay. The bankruptcy listed debts of $11.5 million against assets of just over $6 million. His role in Boogie Nights in 1997 earned an Oscar nomination and a partial comeback, but he never fully recovered financially. When Burt Reynolds died in 2018 at 82, his estate was approximately $5 million, respectable, but a fraction of what he'd earned and lost. Gary Coleman. As Arnold Jackson on Different Strokes, Gary Coleman earned roughly $70,000 per episode. His total earnings were estimated at $18 million. For a kid from Zion, Illinois, with a congenital kidney condition that stunted his growth, it should have been life-changing. It was, just not the way it should have been. His parents and former business advisor managed his money right into their own pockets. When Gary turned 18, the vast majority of his earnings had been spent on legal fees, management commissions, and his parents' living expenses. In 1989, he sued and won a settlement of $1.28 million, a devastating fraction of $18 million. The lawsuit ended his relationship with his parents and left deep scars. After Different Strokes, consistent work vanished. He was typecast, and his small stature limited roles. By 1999, he'd filed for bankruptcy. The settlement money had been consumed by medical bills, at least 2 kidney transplants, ongoing dialysis, and basic living costs. He took a widely publicized job as a security guard, a moment that became a late-night punchline, but was really a sad commentary on how Hollywood devours its youngest stars. Gary Coleman died on May 28, 2010, at 42, from an intracranial hemorrhage. He left behind virtually no estate. The boy who made America laugh had been robbed of far more than money. Corey Haim. After breaking out in Lucas and cementing his status with the Lost Boys, Corey Haim seemed destined for a long career. But behind the magazine covers, he was already struggling with trauma from exploitation and abuse by powerful Hollywood figures, something both he and his friend Corey Feldman spoke about publicly. That trauma led him into drug addiction that consumed both his health and finances. By the early 1990s, his career had stalled. His reputation for unreliability grew, and big paychecks were replaced by meager fees from over 20 direct-to-video films. Not artistic choices, but financial desperation. Drug addiction is expensive. The substances, the lost opportunities, the medical and legal bills. Whatever financial infrastructure a teen star might have had dissolved long ago. By the 2000s, Haim was essentially destitute, living with his mother in a small Toronto apartment. He and Feldman attempted a comeback with the Two Coreys reality series in 2007, but it laid bare the extent of his struggles. On March 10, 2010, Corey Haim was found dead at 38. He had no significant assets or savings. His mother relied on donations from fans and industry friends to cover funeral expenses. The teen idol who once had the world at his feet left it with nothing. Billie Holiday. Billie Holiday remains one of the most influential vocalists in American music history, but the woman behind that voice never knew financial security. Growing up in poverty, enduring childhood abuse, she was working Harlem nightclubs by her mid-teens. Her recording contracts were notoriously exploitative. She received flat fees rather than royalties. No matter how many copies sold, she saw nothing beyond the initial payment. Labels made fortunes from her voice while she scraped by on performance fees that were siphoned away by managers, agents, and abusive partners who helped themselves to her earnings. Her heroin addiction, beginning in the early 1940s, was a relentless drain. In 1947, she was arrested on drug charges and spent nearly a year in a federal reformatory. Upon release, she was stripped of her New York City cabaret card, the permit required to perform in venues serving alcohol. Since virtually every jazz club served alcohol, this effectively banned her from performing in her home city, eliminating her most reliable income source. Billie Holiday died on July 17, 1959, at 44, with 70 cents in the bank and $750 strapped to her leg. Even in her final days, she was arrested for drug possession while lying in her hospital bed. The woman whose voice moved millions was exploited to the very end. Omar Sharif. After Lawrence of Arabia and Dr. Zhivago, Omar Sharif was an international sensation, but he had an addiction more expensive than any lifestyle extravagance: gambling. Sharif was a world-class bridge player, but his gambling extended far beyond bridge. He was a fixture at casinos across Europe, and his losses were staggering. Tens of millions over his lifetime, particularly at baccarat and roulette. He once described losing the equivalent of an entire film's salary in a single evening. As debts mounted, he took roles far beneath his talent, low-budget productions and forgettable comedies, not because he wanted to, but because the casinos expected payment. He spoke openly about his regrets, how gambling had hollowed out his financial life and destroyed his most important relationships. Omar Sharif died in Cairo on July 10, 2015, at 83. While not destitute, his estate was a shadow of what it might have been. The man who played princes and poets had gambled away a fortune most people couldn't imagine possessing. Bela Lugosi. Bela Lugosi's 1931 Dracula defined the character for generations. But here's the critical detail. Lugosi was paid a flat fee of approximately $3,500. No residuals, no profit participation, just $3,500 for one of the most iconic performances in film history. After turning down Frankenstein's monster, a decision he deeply regretted, Lugosi found himself typecast in horror roles of diminishing quality and pay. By the 1940s, he was appearing in Poverty Row productions for a fraction of what top actors commanded, while developing a serious morphine addiction prescribed for chronic pain. In the 1950s, he committed himself for addiction treatment, and afterward was essentially broke. He fell into the orbit of Ed Wood, appearing in some of the worst films ever made, not as artistic choices, but acts of financial desperation. Ed Wood paid next to nothing, but next to nothing was more than Lugosi had. Bela Lugosi died on August 16, 1956, at 73, virtually penniless. He was buried in his Dracula cape, the most poignant symbol in Hollywood history. The man who gave the world its most famous monster died as one of its most tragic figures. Andy Gibb. Andy Gibb had 3 consecutive #1 singles before his 21st birthday. As the youngest Bee Gees brother, he seemed destined for superstardom, but his relationship with money was almost as destructive as his relationship with cocaine, and the two were deeply intertwined. At his peak, Andy earned millions, but his cocaine addiction was voracious, reportedly costing tens of thousands per week. He was fired from Solid Gold for erratic behavior. Concert promoters dropped him, record sales plummeted. By the early 1980s, the hits and income had stopped, but the expenses hadn't. His brothers spent significant sums on rehabilitation programs and covering his debts. But addiction is a relentless creditor. By the mid-1980s, Andy was effectively bankrupt. He moved to England hoping for a fresh start, but his health was failing. On March 10, 1988, 5 days after his 30th birthday, Andy Gibb died of myocarditis directly linked to years of drug abuse. He died with virtually nothing. The youngest Gibb had burned through everything in barely a decade. Harry Nilsson. The Beatles called Harry Nilsson their favorite American artist. Everybody's Talkin', Without You, Coconut. His catalog is stacked with cultural touchstones. He won 2 Grammys and was revered by peers like few artists ever achieve. He was also spectacularly bad with money. He spent with abandon and was legendary for all-night drinking sessions, often with John Lennon during Lennon's Lost Weekend period. But it wasn't just partying. A financial advisor invested and subsequently lost a significant portion of Nilsson's life savings in failed ventures during the 1980s. Some accounts suggest upwards of $5 million. The loss forced Nilsson, who had stepped back from music, to consider returning not from passion, but necessity. He spent his final years trying to rebuild, but heavy drinking and smoking had devastated his health. Harry Nilsson died of heart failure on January 15, 1994, at 52, leaving behind a wife, 7 children, and an estate burdened with debt. The genius who wrote some of America's most beautiful songs died worrying about how his family would be provided for. Marvin Gaye. Marvin Gaye was the Prince of Motown. What's Going On? Let's Get It On, Sexual Healing. His discography reads like a greatest hits of American music. He sold tens of millions of records. He was also perpetually broke. Like many Motown artists, his contract heavily favored the label, low royalties, with Motown retaining ownership of his masters. Despite being one of their biggest stars, Marvin felt financially squeezed. His personal spending was enormous: expensive homes, cars, and an increasingly serious cocaine habit. Then came the divorces. His split from Anna Gordy, Berry Gordy's sister, produced one of music's strangest settlements. Marvin agreed to pay her $600,000 in royalties from his next album. That album, Here My Dear, was a brutally honest record about their failed marriage, made entirely to pay off the divorce. By the early 1980s, he owed the IRS millions and was living in financial exile across Europe. Sexual Healing in 1982 signaled a comeback, but its earnings were consumed by debts and his worsening cocaine addiction. On April 1, 1984, one day before his 45th birthday, Marvin Gaye was shot and killed by his own father during a domestic dispute. When his estate was settled, debts far exceeded assets. The man who gave the world some of its most beautiful music died violently, tragically, and broke. 12 legends, 12 fortunes, all of it gone. The tragedy isn't just the money, it's what it represents. Every dollar lost was a door that closed. Every debt was a chain that kept them performing when their bodies were breaking, kept them signing contracts they knew were terrible, kept them surrounded by people who saw them not as artists or human beings, but as ATMs with a pulse. Hollywood has always been better at creating stars than protecting them. The studios got rich, the labels got rich. The managers and agents and lawyers, they all got rich. But the people whose talent made all of it possible, too many of them died with nothing. If these stories teach us anything, it's that fame and fortune are not the same thing, and that fortune, without the wisdom to protect it, is just a longer fall from a higher place. If this video moved you, hit that subscribe button and leave a comment below. Let us know which story hit you the hardest. Because these names deserve to be remembered, not just for what they lost, but for the extraordinary gifts they gave the world before it all slipped away.